spots where I freaking, for some reason, I find it so funny when he's running from the show. I love it.
That's why I'm here. So we're on page 71, chapter 5 of The Lord of the Flies, meeting, come to order. Woo!
I can't even imagine how hard that probably is.
I love the deep breath. Just the tomato.
Thank you. The place of assembly in which he stood was roughly a triangle, but irregular and sketchy, page 71. But sketchy like everything they made. First, there was the log on which he himself sat, a dead tree that must have been quite exceptionally big for the platform. Perhaps one of those legendary storms of the Pacific had shifted it here. This palm trunk lay parallel to the beach, so that when Ralph sat, he faced the island, but the boy's was a darkish figure against the shimmer of the lagoon. The two sides of the triangle of which the log was base were less evenly defined. On the right was a log polished by restless seats along the top, but not so large as the chief's and not so comfortable. On the left were 4 small logs, one of them, the farthest, lamentably springy. Assembly after assembly had broken up in laughter when someone had leaned too far back and the log whipped and thrown half a dozen boys backwards into the grass. Yet now he saw no one had the wit, not himself, nor Jack, nor Piggy, to bring a stone and wedge the thing, so they would continue enduring the ill-balanced twister because, again, he lost himself in deep waters. So he's describing the platform where the meeting place is, and he's saying left and right. Why is he saying that? If you walk down the House of Representatives chamber, down the middle, on the right side are Republicans, on the left side are Democrats. Same thing in the Senate. If you walk down the middle aisle of the Senate chamber, on the right side are Republicans, on the left side are Democrats. So Golding is bringing this up for those same reasons. Even English Parliament has a left and a right. Grass was worn away in front of each trunk, but grew tall and untrodden in the center of the triangle. So notice it's in the predicate, not in the subject. Then at the apex, the grass was thick again because no one sat there. All around the place of assembly, the gray trunks rose, straight or leaning, and supported the low roof of leaves. On 2 sides was the beach, behind the lagoon, in front, the darkness of the island. Ralph turned to the chief's seat. They had never had an assembly as late before. That was why the place looked so different. Normally, the underside of the green roof was lit by a tangle of golden reflections, and their faces were lit upside down, like, thought Ralph, when you hold an electric torch in your hands. But now the sun was slanting in at one side, so that the shadows were where they ought to be. Again, he fell into that strange mood of speculation that was so foreign to him. If faces were different when lit from above or below, what was a face? What was anything? Ralph moved impatiently. The trouble was, if you were a chief, you had to think. You had to be wise. And then the occasion slipped by so that you had to grab at a decision. This made you think, because thought was a valuable thing that got results. Only, decided Ralph as he faced the chief's seat, I can't think. Not like Piggy. Once more that evening, Ralph had to adjust his values. Piggy could think. He could go step by step inside that fat head of his. Only Piggy was no chief. But Piggy, for all his ludicrous body, had brains. Ralph was a specialist in thought now and could recognize thought in another. Yeah, I want to remember that. I want to be able to get back to that one. So our third person narrator is giving us a lot of insight and intelligence into Piggy. The sun in his eyes reminded him how time was passing, so he took the conch down from the tree and examined the surface. Exposure to the air had bleached the yellow and pink to near white and transparency. Ralph felt a kind of affectionate reverence for the conch. Even though he had fished the thing out of the lagoon himself, he faced the place of assembly and put the conch to his lips. The others were waiting for this and came straight away. Those who were aware that a ship had passed the island while the fire was out were subdued by the thought of Ralph's anger, while those, including the little ones who did not know, were impressed by the general air of solemnity. The place of assembly filled quickly. Jack, Simon, Maurice, most of the hunters on Ralph's right. The rest on the left, under the sun. Piggy came and stood outside the triangle. This indicated that he wished to listen, but would not speak, and Piggy intended it as a gesture of disapproval. The thing is, we need an assembly. No one said anything, but the faces turned to Ralph were intent. He flourished the conch. He had learnt as a practical business that fundamental statements like this had to be said at least twice before everyone understood them. One had to sit, attracting all eyes to the conch, and drop words like heavy round stones among the little groups that crouched or squatted. He was searching his mind for simple words so that even the little ones would understand what the assembly was about. Later, perhaps, practiced debaters, Jack, Maurice, Piggy, would use their whole art to twist the meeting. But now at the beginning, the subject of the debate must be laid out clearly. We need an assembly, not for fun, not for laughing, or falling off the log. The group of little ones on the twister giggled and looked at each other. Not for making jokes or for, he lifted the conch in an effort to find the compelling word, for cleverness. Not for these things, but to put things straight. He paused for a moment. I've been alone. By myself I went, thinking what's what. I know what we need, an assembly to put things straight. And first of all, I'm speaking. He paused for a moment and automatically pushed back his hair. Piggy tiptoed to the triangle, his ineffectual protest made, and joined the others. Ralph went on. We have lots of assemblies. Everybody enjoys speaking and being together. We decide things, but they don't get done. We were going to have water brought from the stream and left in those coconut shells under fresh leaves. So it was, for a few days. Now there's no water. The shells are dry. People drink from the river. There was a murmur of assent. Not that there's anything wrong with the drinking from the river. I mean, I'd sooner have water from that place, you know, the pool where the waterfall is, than out of an old coconut shell. Only we said we'd have water brought, and now not. There were only 2 full shells there this afternoon. He licked his lips. Then there's huts, shelters. The murmur swelled again and died away. You mostly sleep in shelters tonight, except for Sam Narek up by the fire. You'll all sleep there. Who built the shelters? Clamor rose at once. Everyone had built the shelters. Ralph had to wave the conch once more. Wait a minute. I mean, who built all 3? We all built the first one, 4 of us the second one, and me and Simon built the last one over there. That's why it's so tottery. No, don't laugh. That shelter might fall down if the rain comes back. We'll need those shelters then. He paused and cleared his throat. There's another thing. We chose those rocks right along beyond the bathing pool as a lavatory. That was sensible too. The tide cleans the place up. You little uns know about that. There were sniggers here and there and swift glances. Now people seem to use anywhere, even near the shelters and the platform. You little uns, when you're getting fruit, if you're taking short, the assembly roared. I said if you're taking short, so you take your shorts down, and if you're taking short, you keep away from the fruit. That's dirty. Laughter rose again. I said that's dirty. He plucked at his stiff gray shirt. That's really dirty. If you're taking short, you go right along the beach to the rocks. See? Piggy held out his hands for the conch, but Ralph shook his head. This speech was planned, point by point. We've all got to use the rocks again. This place is getting dirty. He paused. The assembly, sensing a crisis, was tensely expectant. And then, about the fire. Ralph let out a spare breath with a little gasp that was echoed by his audience. Jack started to chip a piece of wood with his knife and whispered something to Robert, who looked away. The fire is the most important thing on the island. How can we ever be rescued except by luck? If we don't keep a fire going, is a fire too much for us to make? He flung out an arm. Look at us. How many are we? And yet we can't keep a fire going to make smoke? Don't you understand? Can't you see we ought to die before we let the fire out? There was a self-conscious giggling among the hunters. Ralph turned on them passionately. You hunters, you can laugh. But I tell you, the smoke is more important than the pig, however often you kill one. Do all of you see? He spread his arms wide and turned to the whole triangle. We've got to make smoke up there or die. He paused, feeling for his next point. And another thing, someone called out. Too many things. There came mutters of agreement. Ralph overrode them. And another thing. We nearly set the whole island on fire, and we waste time rolling rocks and making little cooking fires. Now I say this and make it a rule, because I'm chief. We won't have a fire anywhere but on the mountain, ever. There was a row immediately. Boys stood up and shouted, and Ralph shouted back, because if you want a fire to cook fish or crab, you can jolly well go up to the mountain. That way we'll be certain. Hands were reaching for the conch in the light of the setting sun. He held on and leapt on the trunk. All this I meant to say. Now I've said it. You voted me for chief. Now you do what I say. They quieted slowly, and at last were seated again. Ralph dropped down and spoke in his ordinary voice. So remember, the rocks are for the lavatory. Keep the fire going and smoke showing us a signal. Don't take fire from the mountain. Take your food up there. Jack stood up, scowling in the gloom, and held out his hands. I haven't finished yet. But you've talked and talked. I've got the conch. Jack sat down, grumbling. Then the last thing. This is what people can talk about. He waited till the platform was very still. Things are breaking up, and I don't understand why. We began well, we were happy, and then he moved the conch gently, looking beyond them at nothing, remembering the beastie, the snake, the fire, the talk of fear. Then people started getting frightened. A murmur, almost a groan, rose and passed away. Jack had stopped whittling. Ralph went on abruptly. But that's Little Un's talk. We'll get that straight. So the last part, the bit we can all talk about, is kind of deciding on the fear. The hair was creeping into his eyes again. We've got to talk about this fear and decide there's nothing in it. I'm frightened myself sometimes, only that's nonsense, like bogeys. Then, when we've decided, we can start again and be careful about things, like the fire. A picture of three boys walking along the bright beach flitted through his mind. And be happy. Ceremonially, Ralph laid the conch on the trunk beside him as a sign that the speech was over. What sunlight reached them was level. Jack stood up and took the conch. So this is a meeting to find out what's what? I'll tell you what's what. You Little Un started all this with the fear talk, beasts. Where from? Of course we're frightened sometimes, but we put up with being frightened. Only Ralph says you scream in the night. What does that mean by nightmares? Anyway, you don't hunt or build or help. You're a lot of crybabies and sissies. That's what. And so for the fear, you'll have to put up with that, like the rest of us. Ralph looked at Jack open-mouthed, but Jack took no notice. The thing is, fear can't hurt you any more than a dream. There aren't any beasts to be afraid of on this island. He looked along the row of whispering Little Uns. Serve you right if something did get you, you useless lot of crybabies. But there is no animal. Ralph interrupted him testily. What is all this? Who said anything about an animal? You did, the other day. You said they dream and cry out. Now they talk. Not only the Little Uns, but my hunters sometimes. Talk of a thing, a dark thing, a beast, some sort of animal. I've heard. You thought not, didn't you? Now listen, you don't get big animals on small islands, only pigs. You only get lions and tigers in big countries like Africa and India. Africa's not a country! And the zoo, I've got the conch. I'm not talking about the fear. I'm talking about the beast. Be frightened if you like, but as far as the beast... Jack paused, cradling the conch, and turned to his hunters with their dirty black caps. Am I a hunter or am I not? They nodded simply. He was a hunter, all right. No one doubted that. Well then, I've been all over this island, by myself. If there were a beast, I'd have seen it. Be frightened because you're like that? But there is no beast in the forest. Jack handed back the conch and sat down. The whole assembly applauded him with relief. Then Piggy held out his hand. I don't agree with all Jack said, but with some. Of course, there isn't a beast in the forest. How could there be? What would a beast eat? Pig. We eat pig. Piggy! I got the conch, said Piggy indignantly. Ralph, they ought to shut up, oughtn't they? You shut up, you little uns. What I mean is that I don't agree about this here fear. Of course there isn't nothing to be afraid of in the forest. Well, I've been there myself. You'll be talking about ghosts and such things next. We know what goes on, and if there's something wrong, there's someone to put it right. He took off his glasses and blinked at them. The sun had gone as if the light had been turned off. He proceeded to explain. If you get a pain in your stomach, whether it's a little one or a big one, yours is a big one. When you're done laughing, perhaps you can get on with the meeting. And if the little ones climb back on the twister, sit on the ground and listen. No, you have doctors for everything, even in the inside of your mind. You don't really mean that we got to be frightened all the time of nothing. Life, said Piggy expansively, is scientific. That's what it is. In a year or two, when the war's over, they'll be traveling to Mars and back. I know there isn't no beast, not with claws and all that. But I know there isn't no fear either. Piggy paused. Unless... Ralph moved restlessly. Unless what? Unless we get frightened of people. A sound, half laugh, half jeer, rose among the seated boys. Piggy ducked his head and went on hastily. So let's hear from the little ones who talked about a beast, and perhaps we can show him how silly he is. The little ones began to jabber among themselves. Then one stood forward. What's your name? Oh, so they're still finding out their names? Phil? For a little one, he was self-confident, holding out his hands, cradling the conch as Ralph did, looking round at them to collect their attention before he spoke. Last night I had a dream, a horrid dream, fighting with things. I was outside the shelter by myself, fighting with things, those twisty things in the trees. He paused, and the other little ones laughed in horrified sympathy. Then I was frightened, and I woke up, and I was outside the shelter by myself in the dark, and the twisty things had gone away. The vivid horror of this, so possible and so nakedly terrifying, held them all silent. The child's voice went piping on from behind the white conch. And I was frightened, and I started to call out for Ralph. And then I saw something moving among the trees, something big and horrid. He paused, half frightened by the recollection, yet proud of the sensation he was creating. That was a nightmare, said Ralph. He was walking in his sleep. The assembly murmured in subdued agreement. The little one shook his head stubbornly. I was asleep when the twisty things were fighting, and when they went away, I was awake. And I saw something, big and horrid, moving in the trees. Ralph held out his hands for the conch, and the little one sat down. You were asleep. There wasn't anyone there. How could anyone be wandering about in the forest at night? Did anyone go out? There was a long pause while the assembly grinned at the thought of anyone going out in the darkness. Then Simon stood up, and Ralph looked at him in astonishment. You? What were you mucking about in the dark for? Simon grabbed the conch convulsively. I wanted to go to a place I know? What place? Just a place I know. A place in the jungle. Remember when Simon stole away to go... we theorized or hypothesized that he was going potty, and he was in that really secluded jungle place where he could see out, but no one could see in. Kind of a little hiding zone in the jungle. He hesitated. Jack settled the question for them with that contempt in his voice that could sound so funny and so final. He was taken short. Dropping your trousers and taking a growler. That's a couplet. With a feeling of humiliation on Simon's behalf, Ralph took back the conch, looking Simon sternly in the face, and he did so. Well, don't do it again, understand? Not at night. There's enough silly talk about beasts without the little one seeing you gliding about like the derisive laughter that rose had fear in it and condemnation. Simon opened his mouth to speak, but Ralph had the conch, so he backed to his seat. When the assembly was silent, Ralph turned to Piggy. Well, Piggy? There was another one. Him. The Littlands pushed Percival forward, then left him by himself. He stood knee-deep in the central grass, looking at his hidden feet, trying to pretend he was in a tent. Ralph remembered another small boy who had stood like this, and he flinched away from the memory. Ooh. He had pushed the thought down and out of sight, where only some positive reminder like this could bring it out to the surface. There had been no further numberings of the Littlands, partly because there was no means of ensuring that all of them were accounted for, and partly because Ralph knew the answer to at least one question Piggy had asked on the mountaintop. Remember when Piggy was going, "What are you guys doing? We have kids down there." There were little boys, fair, dark, freckled, and all dirty, but their faces were all dreadfully free of a major blemishes. No one had seen the mulberry-colored birthmark kid again. But that time Piggy had coaxed and bullied, tacitly admitting that he remembered the unmentionable. Ralph nodded to Piggy. Go on, ask him. Piggy knelt, holding the conch. So that kid is still gone. All right. Up to page 80.